Yes, that's right. I'm going into another slasher movie, and I know it's only been 2 weeks since I did the Halloween review. And since this is the last Friday the 13th of the year, I thought I'd return to this particular series with Friday the 13th, Part 2. And I'm probably going to be mentioning some things that I brought up in my review of the first Friday the 13th, so if you haven't seen the first review, I recommend checking it out. I hope more people see this review than they did with the first one. And anyone who's been watching me regularly will know that I always hold up the spoiler card when I'm going to be talking about something spoiler-esque. But with Friday the 13th, it's a little hard to know when to use it because virtually everybody knows the story for this franchise, even those who haven't seen the movies. So it's probably not that big of a deal, but once again, I still recommend checking out the first review just so you know what I thought of the first Friday the 13th. And to sum up briefly what I thought of the first movie, I said that I used to really love the first one a lot, and as I've gotten older and as I've watched the first movie over and over again, I find that it's not a very rewatchable movie. I mean, the first Friday the 13th, yeah, it does set up the series in a way, and the gore effects are pretty amazing and stay the art of the times from the legendary Tom Savini. But the main problem I found with the first movie was, with the exception of the kill scenes, the movie's kind of boring at times. Like, it's not a movie I'd watch all the way through. I think if I was to rewatch it again, I'd maybe fast forward through a few parts. And I don't hate it, but at the same time, it's not the greatest, and I used to think it was a little better than the sequels, because it handled things a little seriously, but at the same time, just because it handled it seriously and tried not to be too silly, does not mean it makes its content interesting. And in the second Friday the 13th, this is what really kicked the series off. And next to owning the first through 8th films on the hologram DVD covers, Part 2 is the only one in the series that I ever got on VHS, back when I was getting the series one by one. Quick fact before I talk about the movie. If you notice, there's a picture of two people getting impaled while in the middle of having sex, and this scene has become known as the double penetration scene. And this image of the two of them getting speared was actually cut from the movie. The scene was edited so you don't actually see the image of the spear going into them. You just see the spear raised, and then the camera cuts to under the bed where we see it shoot right through the bed into the floor, and we see blood dripping. The filmmakers were forced to cut a part of the scene out, but then for some reason there was no trouble getting part of the shot cut out, put on the back. And from what I read, only 48 seconds from Friday the 13th Part 2 had to be deleted to avoid an X rating. Not bad given the shit that the sequels would have to go through. And as for the gore and the violence and the sex in Friday the 13th Part 2, it's pretty good. It kind of ups the ante a little, but still keeps it to the same tone of the first movie, and the effects in the first movie were very impressive and very good. Unfortunately, Tom Savini did not return for Friday the 13th Part 2. He was busy working on another slasher movie at the time, The Burning, which in itself is much better than the first Friday the 13th. And The Burning, that is definitely a slasher movie to check out. It was one of the very first slasher movies I ever saw, and that movie nearly scared the piss out of me. Seriously, the 1981 slasher film The Burning, it is incredible, and I'm not going to let this become a review of that movie, but I say check it out. And I think I've stalled enough, and I might have sounded a bit awkward there. It's a little late. So let's get into the plot. Friday the 13th Part 2 opens very shortly after the events of the first film, and it focuses on the heroine of the first movie, Alice, played by Adrienne King. And she is having a nightmare about the events of the first Friday the 13th. And this just is sort of a way to show what happened in the first film, how it ended. Yeah, slasher sequels, they sometimes feel the need to show flashbacks in the beginning of the first movie or the first couple, because it seems like the filmmakers of these movies back then seemed to think that people who saw the first film would forget about it. And the opening of the second movie is really what separates it from the first one and shows how it's improved on the flaws the first movie had. Because the opening scene of the second movie, it actually establishes suspense and tension. And as I said in my review of the first Friday the 13th, it wasn't really that scary. But with the opening scene of Part 2, you totally feel on edge. And as Alice is having these nightmares, we see this mysterious set of legs walking to her house. And people who don't even know will know who this killer is. It's Jason Voorhees. And fun fact, the legs you see in that opening scene are actually the legs of a woman named Ellen Lutter. And yeah, she was just a stand-in for that shot, and this technically makes it the only time in the series where Jason is played by a woman. It's just cool to know. And what I'm going to tell you next will require the spoiler card, but before I get into that, before we see Jason's legs walk into the frame, we see this little kid sort of stomping and skipping through these puddles on the street, singing, "Itsy bitsy spider went up the water spout." And it's one of those little kid voices that just grates you and makes you annoyed. And when the kid's mother tells him to get inside, the little brat just stomps in the puddle. And it's a little grating, but... And I just mention it because as soon as the kid steps out of the shot, that's when we see Jason enter. And the cinematography for this very low shot is very well done. And now on to the spoilers of the opening scene. While I thought the character Alice, her final battle in the first Friday the 13th with Mrs. Voorhees, Jason's mother, I thought it was extremely unconvincing. It just didn't feel like a real fight, and it was hard to believe that Alice could beat this person who had killed nearly 10 people. And it was hard to believe that this old crazy bitch had been able to kill all these camp counselors, but couldn't take down this skinny woman in her 20s, who, from what we had seen, didn't really show any signs that she knew how to fight. And the fight was just embarrassing. But despite all that, Alice, she was pretty likable, pretty cute, and you were glad, I guess, at the end of the first film that she was able to survive. Part 2 did that thing that a lot of horror sequels do. They'll take the main character of the last movie, and then they'll show them for maybe the opening scene or maybe the first half of this new movie, and then they will have them killed off. I guess either to bring in new characters or just to have a callback. This kind of thing can be frustrating, but it's also effective because we only see Alice for the first less than 15 minutes, but we get a lot of character with her in that opening scene. We see that she's recovering and that she's living alone and she's trying to take up a hobby, I guess, of drawing. And we see some very well done pieces of art by her. And we see that she has a cat. And all the while, we see that she has this creeping suspicion that there might be someone in her house. And there's some jump scares in there, and That's another thing. The jump scares in Friday the 13th Part 2 are incredible. I mean, the jump scares, they really make you jump. Even, and as I said, watching the first Friday the 13th many times, it didn't scare me anymore and it wasn't effective anymore. But in Part 2, after I've seen this movie many times and I know the scares are coming, they still manage to make me shake a little. And in Part 2, we have a few fake outs, and Alice thinks she might be safe. And then she opens her refrigerator, and what do we see in this refrigerator? The severed head of Mrs. Pamela Voorhees. Then just an earlier flashback showed once again that Alice had cut her head off. And Alice screams in horror, and the sight of the head is not extremely shocking. Maybe for the non-horror fan bitch wimp, but when she screams and all of a sudden Jason comes up to her and just stabs her in the head with an ice pick. And when that moment happens, it's not extremely graphic, but when it happens, for me and probably a lot of people have admitted this, it's so sad. Because you feel like she was a good person. She didn't do anything wrong. And she didn't deserve this. And even though she doesn't have a lot of time, we kind of got to know her a little bit. Not much, because no real character development happened in the first film, but she was likable and nice, and it's sad. And the opening was a real good way to start off this movie. And then the opening credits happen. And while it doesn't have the shattering the screen effect that the title card in the first movie had, the second one, I guess, shows that they are gonna up their game by having Friday the 13th soar at us. And then there's a huge ass explosion and we see the word Part 2. And the 2 is just like 4 times the size of the word part. And you know, this movie is gonna bring more and just be bigger. And then we see that 5 years after the events of the first Friday the 13th, a new camp is opening on Crystal Lake. Camp Crystal Lake has been closed, obviously due to the over a dozen murders that have happened there. And this new camp has a set of new counselor characters, or as many would call them, fresh meat, preparing to open the new camp, welcome the kids, and also lining up to be hacked and slashed. And while the plot is pretty much the same as the first movie, there definitely is more going on. It spreads out over a bigger course of time than the first movie, and the characters aren't confined to just the cabins and the beach. There is a scene where they go to the beach on the lake, but there's also scenes of them actually leaving the camp, going into town, and hanging out there, while the ones staying behind get... And the characters in this movie, unlike the first film where the characters were just kind of bland and just said stuff that sounded like the writer just thought it up about 5 minutes before they had to shoot it because all they cared about was the gore. The characters in Part 2, although not the most three-dimensional, they do have a bit more personality than the other kids, and their dialogue, while not Oscar-worthy, it is funny and interesting to listen to, and the characters do show more than one personality trait. There's no actors in this movie that would go on to be bigger stars. The Friday the 13th series wouldn't have any future bloomers until it did Part 4, or as it's officially called, the final chapter. Aside from Adrienne King returning briefly as Alice, oh, by the way, Adrienne King, she asked that her appearance be brief because apparently some asshole decided to stalk her after seeing her in the first movie and actually was able to get into her home. And because of that, after Friday the 13th Part 2, she didn't act in a movie for over 20 years, I believe. Well, she's back and she appears at the horror conventions and she's still got a great scream in her. The main heroine of Friday the 13th Part 2 is a woman named Ginny. Ginny. You know, like the chick in the Harry Potter movies. And Ginny is played by Amy Steele. Like I said, the actors in Part 2 didn't really go that far as movies, as far as I've seen. And Amy Steele, she's definitely not Alice from Part 1, and she has a lot of personality, and unlike Alice, she's not really that likable. She's a real bitch throughout the film, or a real whiner, and she's real emotionally sensitive. Like, she's the type of character that would probably break down crying if you squished the wrong type of insect. And I guess Amy Steele is pretty, but throughout the film, she looks very exhausted. When you look at her face, she's kind of reddish, like she's stoned, and I know there's a lot of stoners in the Friday the 13th series. Brought out the shirt. But her character, Ginny, is not established as being that much of a pothead. And she also has what appear to be those kind of baggy, sleep-deprived eyes, so I've not read any trivia on this, but the way Amy Steele looks in Part 2, you kind of get the impression maybe she had insomnia or something during filming. Or maybe just being on the campgrounds during filming was unnerving. I got a pretty big sneaking suspicion that she had insomnia. But yeah, a lot of actors on the series, and not just Part 2, but most of the movies, have said that they were pretty actually scared while making these films, because, hey, camp can be a pretty creepy place. I've gone camping, and although it wasn't creepy for me, it wasn't pleasant, and I don't plan to go camping ever again. And how would I describe the character of Ginny? Well, she is friends with the guy who's running the camp, Paul, played by John Fury. Yeah, Fury. Not like Nick Fury, it's F-U-R-E-Y, I don't know how else to pronounce it. And Ginny and Paul apparently know each other from way back. And Paul, he's like the uptight boss character, and Paul's good enough. He's not bad, but he's not extremely complex or that great. He doesn't take certain things seriously. Like, he takes his job of running the camp seriously, but he is up for having fun. And Ginny, she's just very oversensitive and just overthinks on things that really shouldn't have that much thought put into them at all. Ginny, in her opening scene, comes in a real rusted out shitbox car, and she plays a prank where she has the exhaust pipe shoot into Paul's face. Yeah, like I said, she can be kind of a bitch. And at the same time, she and Paul seem to kind of like each other, and they have sex at one point. Once again, showing that Scream lied on what it takes to survive a slasher movie. And other than knowing Paul from way back and working at the camp, all that's really known about Ginny is that she is studying child psychology. And this would later play a huge part at the end of the film. But yeah, she's studying to be a child psychologist, and this does lead to a scene that doesn't really piss me off, but just makes me go, wow. And what do I mean? Well, all the camp counselors are told a campfire story in the usual bullshit, whispery tone around the flames. I hate that. But they're told about Jason Voorhees and Mrs. Voorhees, and it is questionable how exactly this camp is able to be put up. I mean, and this would be a huge issue for me with the latter sequels, but I'm just wondering how much convincing would it take to reopen or open a new camp in an area where several murders were committed. But back to the campfire shit. Yeah, the counselors are told about Jason, and for some reason, Ginny really gets emotional over this. But it's during a scene where they're at a bar, so yeah, maybe it's affecting her way of thinking. She says, Jason's mother was killed, and they bring up the theory that perhaps Jason survived and he witnessed his mother's beheading. And she says, how horrible would it have been for a little kid to have seen his mother killed like that, all because she loved him. And yeah, it's definitely because she's drunk, or she's just being an oversensitive wuss. But this scene leads to a bunch of dialogue that is definitely of the times. And this scene is kind of meant to show her supposed study of child psychology and how she thinks about child psychology. She says, what if there is some boy beast running around? Let's put it in real terms. Think outside the box. What would he be like today? An out-of-control psychopath? A frightened retard? A child trapped in a man's body? This scene did not anger me, and I have used the word retard many times, so I don't have a problem with using it. Such as joke-wise, or just talking about a certain dumb character. But what bothered me about this scene was, what kind of psychologist talks like this? I mean, I know it's the 80s and psychology was different back then, but and she's trying to speak like a caring, lovey type woman character, and it's a little hard to sound sincere and caring when you call someone a retard. If a psychologist really thinks that is the way to talk to someone who is mentally handicapped, then they're the retarded one. All I can think is, if I came across a psychologist that spoke like that, an out-of-control psychopath, a frightened retard, a child trapped in a man's body, yeah, I'd be like, fuck you, bitch, I'm out of here. I already have a great psychologist. And what's kind of freaky is that Amy Steele in real life, like, I don't know how much she works now, like, as far as acting goes, but I read that she actually works in real life, the actress Amy Steele, she works in the field of therapy and apparently counseling. I'm pretty sure it's just a character, but I really hope the way she goes about the actual job is nothing like this character. I'm pretty sure if this character, Ginny, actually went into the field of psychology, she would not get far. I've seen some idiot psychologists in my time, and as soon as I realized what they were really like, I left. At the end of Friday the 13th Part 2, Ginny and Paul return from a night on the town to the camp, where they find many blood stains in areas of the cabin, and eventually some dead bodies. And Paul is attacked by Jason, and Ginny goes running for her life, and it takes her to this mysterious shack in the woods. And it's established that this shack is where Jason lives. And once inside, she locks herself in one of the back rooms, and she sees this altar of candles with dead bodies on the floor beneath them. And what do these candles surround? The severed head of Jason's mother. And Ginny, apparently working from her child's psychology studies, takes Mrs. Voorhees' sweater, which is on the table, puts it on, and she tries to play to Jason's unstable psyche. And this scene, it's a little questionable just how much it would work, but since Jason's an out-of-control maniac with no way to reason with, the scene works pretty well. And this scene also features a cameo by the original Mrs. Voorhees herself, the late Betsy Palmer. And it's a very brief cameo, and Betsy Palmer would turn down a very similar cameo in the now famous crossover Freddy vs. Jason. But yeah, she's here, and it's a very good scene. And another thing that's not extremely huge, but definitely something you don't see happen with every slasher movie heroine. When Ginny is hiding from Jason, she's hiding under a bed trying to keep quiet, and there's a rat crawling under the bed as well. And at this point, Ginny has encountered many dead bodies. She has seen Jason jump around corners. He's chased her. She's seen him possibly kill her boyfriend. And she's narrowly escaped for her life. And she's hiding under the bed, and this rat crawls under right next to her face. And we then cut to Jason, who's looking for her, and he looks down, and he sees a puddle of urine coming out under the bed. And my thought was, you've been chased by a maniac with a pitchfork. You've seen several dead bodies. He has punched his way through doors and windows with you just a few feet away, and a fucking rat is what finally makes you piss your pants. It's not worth figuring out, but it's a little funny and a scene that's kind of unique. Because, yeah, how often do you see the heroine piss her pants? So, yeah, the character Ginny, she has many flaws, and her way of doing psychology is, I wouldn't say it's even outdated, because I don't think this kind of psychology even existed, even back then, based on what my own psychologist said when I told her about this scene. And she's old enough to have known what it was like back then. But at the same time, yeah, Ginny, she's not heroic in any way. I mean, I know most slasher movie heroines aren't really heroic, but at the same time, Ginny is one of the more pussy type of heroines you'll see in a slasher movie. She is not useless, but she's always crying and whimpering throughout the whole movie, and she does it even more than the usual heroines in these type of movies do. So I guess in some ways, her performance, Amy Steele's performance, is a little more realistic to what someone would be like in this type of situation. Yeah, like people cry, they whimper, they shake, and sometimes people soil themselves in fear. So yeah, I'd say she's a very unique and very interesting character. Not likable, but interesting. And as for the other supporting characters in this movie, as I mentioned with the character Paul, there's not really a ton to him, other than he's good looking, he's nice, and really there's nothing wrong with him. He's a little, maybe, tight ass, but yeah, he's a sort of cool character. And as for the supporting cast members, there are a lot of counselors in this movie, and some of them are not even given any lines. Yeah, like they have so many new characters here that about half of them get enough screen time and are given the interesting character treatment. While some characters are silent and even leave and survive without giving any chance to know them. But yeah, you get the feeling they got a lot of young actors and there was just too many to fully work with. But for the ones they do work with, there's this character Ted, played by actor Stuart Charno, who played a member of the Bullies gang in the movie Christine, based on the Stephen King book, directed by John Carpenter. Stuart Charno is a very skinny, very lanky, red-haired kid. He kind of looks like that dorky doofus you'd know that make all the wise-ass or silly jokes. But at the same time, he is pretty entertaining, and Ted, he says a lot of funny one-liners, and he pulls a lot of funny pranks. One of his funny jokes is, I think, taken from Eddie Murphy's stand-up act. The bear wipes his ass with the rabbit joke. And surprisingly, the character Ted actually survives part 2. And like his last scene is him in a bar after a few of the main characters have been drinking, and he just decides to stay behind and cruise the town. And he has about 20 or 30 beer bottles in front of him, and earlier he says, "I want these. I'm collecting them." How he didn't die of alcohol poisoning is a fucking miracle. And after that, we never see Ted again. He doesn't appear in any of the sequels, and based on that scene, he stays in town and he fucking lives. So Ted, in the end, he's a little annoying but kind of fun character, enjoyable, and he's a character you definitely don't want to see die. And other than Paul and Ginny, there are 2 other main couples in this movie. The first couple is named Sandra, played by Marta Kober, and Jeff, played by Bill Randolph. They are your stereotypical young, horny couple, and there's not much to their characters other than they love to fuck. They're friends with Ted, and Sandra apparently likes to explore areas they're not supposed to go to, like the closed Camp Crystal Lake. And overall, they're nice characters. They don't do too many asshole things. They do annoyingly break the rules when you think, why are you doing this? Why do you want to go see Camp Crystal Lake, you dumb bitch? And doesn't really explain why, other than she's curious. But nothing too bad. Unlike Ted, they're not characters you'll really care about, whether they live or die, but they're there and they're pretty enjoyable. And the other couple you see in this movie is not your average movie couple. Mark, played by Tom McBride, and Vicky, played by Lauren Mary Taylor. And the character Mark, who we're introduced to in the opening, is an extremely buff, muscular athlete, and he's in a wheelchair. And he says later on that he was in an accident, and he has a determined attitude that he will not spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair, saying the doctors think they can make him better, and it's not really a realistic goal to have. I mean, sure, stuff like that can work out, but it's a very slim chance. I mean, even in Monkey Shines, the main character, who's a quadriplegic, was given a very slim chance on regaining his ability to move his limbs. And Mark's he's like the macho guy of the group, a macho guy in a wheelchair, and he's pretty nice, he's like a coach pretty much. He tells people what to do to stay in shape, and it's that kind of coach character where you find him a little annoying, like, stop with the fucking motivation, man. Stop it. In fact, one character even gives him the finger. And the character Vicky, who's kind of his girlfriend, she's a counselor, and she is immediately smitten with him. Yeah, this character, Vicky, she is pretty much fawning over Mark from the first scene of him in the movie, and her attraction to him is so obvious, making further handicap jokes, Even a blind person could see that she's in love with him. And her attraction is a little odd. I mean, Mark is very sexy, but at the same time, he's in a wheelchair, and I could get just being kind of attracted and sympathetic, but at the same time, she makes it pretty clear, like, even before he reveals that he might have a chance to walk again someday, that she would like to fuck him. And Mark does say at one point that he is still able to sort of have sex, but he reveals this after she shows that she really has the hots for him, so yeah, like, what was it about her that made her so determined to want to have sex with him when there was no guarantee that he would even be able to? I don't know. Maybe she has a cripple fetish. And to go into even more politically incorrect waters, so there are girls that are specifically attracted to paraplegics. Well, if that's the case, then where are the girls with the retard fetish? I mean, I'm pretty sure the mentally handicapped would love as much sex as the physically handicapped. And as the characters Mark and Vicky inevitably decide they will try to have sex with each other, she goes back to her cabin, puts on some lingerie, and she takes some perfume and puts it around herself and sprays it between her cleavage. And I guess, thinking it'll be cute, she pulls open her panties and sprays the perfume on her pubes. Well, if her plan was to kill any chance of getting cunnilingus, I'd say she succeeded. And the last two camp counselors, who aren't really a couple, but the film tries to set them up as two people who are opposites but will get together, you know, that cliched route, are Terry, played by Kristen Baker, and Scott, played by Russell Todd. And the character of Terry, she's a pretty woman, and she walks around wearing exercise clothes, tank tops, and jean shorts that ride up her ass so hard you can see her butt jiggling as she walks. And the character of Scott in his opening scene tries to show her that he likes her. How? By shooting her in the butt with a slingshot. And surprisingly, she does not try to go up and hit him. She just turns around and smirks, like she thought it was nice. I wouldn't call this character a slut, because later we see that she has her limits at what she can take from this asshole, but at the same time, what girl would smirk after you shoot her in the ass with a slingshot? It is a little bit of a hot scene, but at the same time, I wouldn't call it cute. And later in the film, the character Terry goes skinny dipping, which I don't understand why she would do, given that the counselor who's made clear he's attracted to her and has made several unwanted advances towards her is also staying behind at the camp. So you can guess where this goes. He snatches her clothes, and she has to chase him mostly naked, and he taunts her. And then the character Scott ends up in one of those rope traps where you step on the loop and it pulls you up in the air. And he's hanging upside down, and Terry, when she sees him, he begs her to go get a knife and help him down, and she crosses her arms going, maybe I should just let you hang there. And I don't care for scenes in movies where women hit men for no reason, but in this case, my thoughts were, you definitely have a reason. And I'm surprised she did go to get a knife to cut him down, because I would hit him in the nuts. Either that, or this could turn into a very dark porno. And I've talked about the camp counselors enough, and I really need to wrap this video up. So let's move on to the main star of this series, Jason Voorhees. And as I mentioned, there are actually many actors who played Jason Voorhees in Part 2. Ellen Lutter was Jason's legs for the opening scene. And for the majority of the film, we don't see Jason in a full body shot. we mainly just see his arms as he kills people or his legs. It's only towards really the third act that we see him in his full form. And many people, when they watch the early Friday the 13th, are surprised to see this. But next to Jason's mother being the killer in the first Friday the 13th, Jason did not start wearing his trademark hockey mask until Friday the 13th Part 3. In Part 2, he wears what I would assume is a potato sack over his head, with a little eye hole for just one eye. This is what Jason looks like in Friday the 13th Part 2. And it's a little debatable if the bag over his head look is more scary than the hockey mask look. But yeah, Jason didn't develop the things we know him best for until the latter part of the series, and in all the scenes where Jason's face is covered up, he is played by stuntman Steve Dash. And he's a pretty good Jason. He has to do a lot of grueling stunts, and something I forgot to mention with Ginny is that unlike Alice in the first Friday the 13th, when Ginny fights Jason here in Part 2, even though it's doubtful that she herself is an experienced fighter, the way she fights Jason and the way he has to repeatedly come at her, it's done a bit more realistically, so I give the movie major props for that. And I know I just put up the spoiler card, but I need to do it again to explain who else played Jason. The ending of the film is pretty confusing, to be honest. Ginny and Paul fight Jason in his shack, and it's been established that Jason has been alive after his mother thought he drowned almost 30 years ago. So, as to where exactly he had been this whole time is very confusing. Anyway, Jason, he lives in this rundown shack in the woods, and you think, has he been living in this shack for 30 years and he hasn't had any basic household appliances or any medical care, or he hasn't spoken to anybody in that time? You think, no wonder he's a fucking maniac. But Ginny and Paul are in the shack at the end and they fight him, and Ginny, copying sort of the battle from the first film between Alice and Mrs. Voorhees, swings down the machete. And unlike the beheading of the first film, when she slices into Jason, the machete just kind of goes here in his shoulder. And even though that really would knock someone down, after Ginny does that, she and Paul take off Jason's bag to see his face, then they just leave. And I find it very questionable why they would just leave, because even though that is a very good way to wound somebody, it's Jason fucking Voorhees. He's practically indestructible, and a machete going into here in the shoulder area, that's not a guaranteed way to kill somebody. But before I go on too fucking long, Ginny and Paul get back to their main cabin, and they see one of their friends' dogs appear, and they think the nightmare is over. And then all of a sudden, Jason crashes through the window, and we see his face. And we see he definitely has the face of someone who is mentally and physically retarded, as the old folks would say. And it's very messed up and mushy. And all I can say is the makeup job at the end for Jason was very well done, and Tom Savini, even though he didn't return, the makeup was done by a guy called Carl Fullerton, and he did a very fine job considering he had to follow in Savini's footsteps. And the ending, as I said, is kind of confusing, because immediately following this scene of Jason crashing through the window, which is kind of reminiscent of Alice getting dragged by Jason at the end of the first film, we cut to Ginny being put into an ambulance and she's traumatized beyond belief. So, like Alice in the first film, you wonder, was this all in her mind? And the second ending is actually even more confusing than the ending of the first Friday the 13th. It's kind of incredible. But once again, it's not really that bad. And Ginny is carted away, probably going to spend years herself in therapy, which I feel is a good comeuppance for her ignorant way of dealing with psychology. And as for the character Paul, yeah, to this day, fans cannot figure out exactly what happened to the character. The ending's just a big, confusing mess. And then the final shot of Friday the 13th Part 2, there's kind of mixed feelings on this shot. The camera zooms in on the decomposing head of Mrs. Voorhees, and she kind of looks like this. And the shot just freezes on the head before the credits roll. And from what I've read, the ending was supposed to be the head's eyes opening and then it's smiling. They cut it out because they thought it would be too hokey, and yeah, I think that might have been a little hokey, but the final shot, it's just not that eventful. So, yeah, I have talked about Friday the 13th Part 2 as much as I possibly can, and I definitely liked it more than Part 1, and Steve Miner, the director, did a fine job. He brought a bit more life to it than Sean S. Cunningham, no disrespect. And the screenplay by Ron Kurz, Kurz, it is pretty alright. And the only real complaint I have with the filmmaking of Friday the 13th Part 2 is the editing, which is not very good when it comes to the transitioning between the killing scenes and the comedic scenes that follow it. From what I read, it was edited by a woman named Susan E. Cunningham, and I don't know if she's Sean Cunningham's wife or daughter, but she is definitely not an editor I would hire. So that's all I gotta say. I give Friday the 13th Part 2 about 7.8 out of 10 stars. It is a kick-ass ride from beginning to end. There's never a boring moment, and I highly recommend it. Oh, and I think I forgot to mention the character Crazy Ralph from my review of the first movie, so I'll just say this now because I don't really have much to say about the character other than he knew what was coming, and you're doomed. You're all doomed. A good, funny character for one or two scenes. I'm out.